Well, again, we don't think that what's going to emerge from Selby, there's no indication that it's going to adversely impact on York, that there's going to be a requirement for York to meet any of Selby's housing need. That historically hasn't been the case. And we have a statement of common ground signed by one of their directors in the last couple of weeks to confirm that's their position as far as they understand it at this particular stage.
Okay, thank you. So then in terms of wider organisations, we've talked about the local authority members and other officer groups. In terms of your other partners, there are a range of other scenarios.
Yeah, again, they're listed or detailed in the documents that are before you. But I think particularly references have been made to the LEPs for both York and North Yorkshire, and for Leeds City Region, and the West Yorkshire Combined Authority. Also, Historic England, Natural England. Most recently, we've had just an update, I think, from Highways England. So we have some of the key organisations that have impact on the plan preparation.
And the frequency of that consultation, is that been focused pretty much on the stages of the plan process, or is that been more regular?
Yes, obviously with a long history of dialogue and consultation, given the journey that the city has been on to get to where we are today. That's quite well documented and set out in those documents that are before you.
You should have received late yesterday a statement of common ground with Highways England as well. I don't know whether it's reached you yet, but there is one.
Right. Okay, thank you very much. I don't think I've got too much more in terms of the actual structure of the duty to cooperate on now. I think a lot of it was touched on in your opening statement, so that's been really helpful. But in terms of the outcomes of the actions that have been undertaken, obviously we've seen the statement that you've identified in the appendix in terms of the actions that are being taken forward on there. I mean, we've touched on things like housing growth particularly, and there's other issues I think that are going to be raised by other parties as well in terms of Greenbelt matters and those sorts of things. No, actually, I think you've answered that question in terms of your office. It's quite a comprehensive one, so I think I'll park that one there. Thank you. Okay. I don't have anything else to say on that matter, but I do note, I was just going to pass it out to other parties. I noticed there's some appended nameplates, so I'm going to start with, forgive me, I think it's Mr. Johnson. Is that right? We start with Mr. Johnson, please.
Thank you, sir. Yes, Mark Johnson from Johnson Mowat, and it's just really to pick up on the point that was raised by yourselves and the City Council about, and it's in our Matter 1 statement, and I'm not really sure it's a matter of soundness as much as a matter for the housing number when we come on to the next stage, in that the disconnect between the Selby district as part of the same housing market area, and indeed perhaps even as we look further north to Hambleton district, who are equally looking at the standard method, is that what you've got is that by having the disconnect with the council taking a different methodology, and I'm not suggesting that this particular district needs to take the standard method because we're under the transitional arrangements, but the fact that you've got the two most direct neighbouring authorities now looking at a lower number under the standard method is that you do potentially then lead to a position whereby this district, by not going towards a figure in the region of the standard method, has then a problem with the housing market area then not supplying sufficient number of houses. And it's the fact that there is a different methodology taking place with the most immediate neighbours that's taken place over a passage of time, the most recent 2 years, whilst we've been considering this plan. We think that there is now a real danger, is that this plan could actually make matters worse in terms of housing land supply in this district and the adjoining districts.
A different method, but both authorities are seeking to, number one, identify need, and then number two, meet it, aren't they? Does it matter if they use different methods to arrive at the calculation of what the need is, do you think?
I don't think it matters so much that they use a different method. I think what matters most of all is that there is a consistency in the overall outcomes, because if they take a different method and there ultimately is a shortfall, so if they'd all adopted the same method and ultimately that housing market area, we'll just use Selby and York as an example, if they adopted the same method and let's say the housing number combined was 1,500 per annum, then that's absolutely fine and those push and pull factors between the two market areas work. But by adopting a slightly different method now, Selby has dropped as a result of the standard method, but York, under its current methodology, has dropped equally. Is that you've essentially got, by not having a similar method, a shortfall of many hundreds of houses per annum within the same housing market area. And my concern is that, and I know reference was made that Selby is going to be until 2023 till it knows where it stands, but from all of the material that's coming from Selby at the moment, they are going down the standard method, and the standard method is currently in play in Selby because their core strategy is now out of date. So by York not adopting a similar method is that you have now got a significant shortfall between the two districts.
Mrs. Hubbard?
Yes, thank you. Just a point of clarification in answer to your question. The reason why Selby has decided to abandon the allocations plan and embark upon a new local plan is nothing to do with any reduction in housing requirement. It's long been recognised in Selby that the core strategy is well out of date, and the decision to abandon the allocations plan was taken at officer level, I think some time ago. It was only endorsed in September, but the new executive member for place shaping has been on record for quite some many months as wishing to see a new plan. It's nothing to do with housing numbers, it's to do with the recognition that the core strategy is well out of date. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I will come back to the council shortly just to make a response to that. However, is it, sorry, Mr. Clark, is it? Yep.
I wasn't intending to speak at this point, but I think it's relevant to what we have to say in general. We're concerned about the narrowness of the plan itself and the way the inquiry is, the examination is being run. We have said from our first response that the local plan is a wide strategic document. It's not a housing and green belt plan. And we have asked for the economic, the transportation and the environmental issues to be considered together. And it is quite evident, knowing the traffic flows, the job flows and the housing flows between York and adjacent authorities, that if you do not look at these issues in the round, you are going to come to the wrong conclusion. And just want to register on our behalf, we'll come back to it, that this decision to work in isolation is reflected in other areas where the plan is being given a more narrow focus than it should be, and this is a long-term land use plan for all activities in the city. And if you don't look at things like the economy and transportation alongside the need for housing and the green belt, then there's a very good chance you'll reach the wrong conclusion. And we do have a concern that the authorities are proceeding in isolation.
Just press that. Okay, thank you. Mr. Corsia, please.
Thank you. So we start with the position that, of course, the scale and location of housing growth is a major strategic issue which cuts across boundaries. But we take also note that the Council, there's been a standing assumption throughout the plan-making process that York will meet its, in full, all its own housing needs. That has been a standing assumption. There hasn't been any positive testing, sir, against the paragraphs 14 or 47 of whether the amount of harm that assumption will cause. And so that will be an issue for you throughout this examination, so I'm not going to go into that detail.
For the avoidance of doubt, you're talking about paragraphs 14 and 47 of the 2012 MPPF.
I am, sir. I am. And of course, sir, if you do conclude that there is harm, then of course you would have to, you would refer yourself to paragraph 179 of the framework, which says that there should be joint working to enable local planning authorities to work together to meet development requirements which cannot be met within their own areas. For instance, because this would cause significant harm to the policies of the framework. And so the policies, just for note, we are going to refer you throughout this hearing. Of course, paragraph 80 dealing with Greenbelt, paragraph 124 dealing with air quality and general environment, and of course paragraph 32 on the highway system, and you've already heard a local resident talking about that. And so that position, of course, is confirmed in the Council's own statement on the legal position that this question of harm is relevant to this local plan, is stated in the legal advice which is contained in the EXCYC 11A document, paragraph 10. So there must be a common ground with the Council that it is a relevant consideration. And of course, it is also linked to the question of general compliance with the RSS. If you come to the conclusion, after hearing all the evidence, that the development limits that have been proposed would harm the special character and setting of the city, then, sir, you would have to conclude there is not general compliance. But in terms of harm, sir, it's not just the view of local residents. We would refer you to paragraph 787 of the TP1 addendum. And that, sir, is a report by, and I think the same, sorry if I guess it's, in fact, what I do have in front of me is 433 of CD 020, exactly the same words virtually, so it doesn't really matter. This was a report by the City Council to the North Yorkshire and York Spatial Planning and Transport Board. Stated, and it has a series of bullet points. I've asked for a copy of this report, but I haven't yet received it, so I would ask through you if I could actually see a copy of this report, and I think that would be relevant to yourselves. It states there is evidence that the housing market extends into adjoining local authority areas, and then it expressly says it expressed the City of York administration's concerns about the impact of meeting York's ONHN on other parts in the framework, including protecting the Greenbelt. And then it sets out the paragraph 14 test. It refers to the duty of to cooperate in those circumstances. But then I think it's in the TP1 addendum, it meekly says, well, the authorities merely said they were at such an advanced stage they wouldn't alter their plans. And on that basis, York accepts it will meet its full OAHN. But so this is clear evidence that there was a request based upon harm, and York didn't explore that any further. There was no further reference to this throughout the documentation. And of course, we have the element of harm which English Heritage actually contain in their own Matter 2 statement, which of course we'll look at in more detail. The position of Heritage England is, of course, that they say that harm will be caused, but they just simply meekly say, well, that harm for the new settlements will be less than that of peripheral development. But they expressly find harm to the special qualities and setting. So our conclusion on the basis of that is that after you've heard all the evidence, you may well wish to conclude that paragraph 179 actually should come into play and there should be joint working. And that, of course, would be...
Forgive me, Mr. Corsier. So is it Corsier, or am I putting too much of a French lilt on it?
Corsier.
Corsier. Paragraph 179, you said,
Yes,
of
The
what?
2012 MPPF, sir, which of course is the part of the MPPF which deals with duty to cooperate. And so if you were then to conclude this plan should be amended to take out those parts of the plan which cause harm, or were you to conclude that the plan should be withdrawn, you have those two alternatives would be in front of you. Then, on that basis, the 2018 MPPF, paragraph 60, would then come into play for the adjoining authorities. When they prepare their plans, they would have to take up York's needs, which could not be met within their own boundaries. So those needs would continue to be met, but in a different way. So I was going to say something about Highways England, but I was not aware there's a statement of common ground. So if we could actually see that statement of common ground and, if necessary, raise that matter later. Thank you.
It's going on the examination website, as is the report from 10th of September 2015, which Mr. Corsier referred to. They both should be on the examination website this morning.
I'm not sure that I was going to quite address this here, but I'm going to now. As I understand it then, or at least I'm hearing, that the council, well, correct me if I get this wrong, I'll put it another way. Did the council go into duty to cooperate discussions, having already taken the decision that York would set out to meet its own housing need?
So you need to look, the problem with what you've just heard is it picks one report at one point in time. If you look at the TP1, for example, that was initially referred to, you'll see that it was the start of the process, and then there are a series of additional meetings and other matters raised, including discussions with Rydale, East Riding, Hambleton, etc., after which the decision was made. This wasn't a predetermined outcome. This was something which emerged having raised this issue in 2015. It was then the outcome of a process of discussion with the neighbouring authorities. And the problem with plucking the 10th...
Forgive me, Mr. Owen, I think you just said it was an outcome of proactive... Did you say proactive? No, I don't think you did. Of discussions with discussions with the other authorities.
And as I say, if you look at TP1, pages 70 to 72, for example, you'll see that the 10th of September 2015 was an early stage in that process, and that there are several other factual discussions and outcomes, discussions and concerns that followed from that. So that was the starting point. It wasn't the finishing point. Is that right? Yes. Mr. Slater says yes. And paragraphs 787 to 794 of TP1.
Of what, sorry?
TP1.
Paras 787.
To 794. TP1 addendum, sorry. Yes. It's the March 29 addendum.
So there were early discussions then about how York's housing need would be met. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
And how did that go? I mean, I'm just trying to kind of picture in my mind's eye what might have gone on at that meeting and how things were approached. Was it a sort of what do you think we should do about this then, chaps? Or what precisely? And they all said, well, we think you should meet it yourselves. And you went, okay.
It wasn't a meeting that I attended, so I don't have any first-hand personal knowledge of that.
I suppose, you know, what I'm getting at is whether or not the council had something in mind at that point or not.
And I think over the years there's been discussions, and there's continued to be discussions between the different authorities about looking at a bigger picture, how different local plans may align, looking at housing market areas, functional economic areas, and that's an ongoing thing. I think it is an issue about people being at various stages with different authorities, and it is quite difficult if you're part way through to suddenly modify your plan, and that's been an ongoing discussion at the 2015 stage. I think it was recognised that if you can meet your housing needs and your employment needs within your own area, then that often is quite, it is easier perhaps to do that. And in terms of then reducing things like commuting, patterns of movement between authorities, a sustainable way forward in terms of plan making, if you can provide employment and housing in close proximity rather than encouraging unsustainable travel to work between different areas. So I think that's a general sort of planning approach. Clearly there are some issues across regions where people will inevitably carry out those journeys. I'm reminded that as part of the discussions there was a full sort of workshop session to engage in this, to have a sort of full and frank and informal discussion about how to take the way forward, and that resulted in the progress that's documented before you in terms of that. That will continue to have a discussion with those authorities going forward, I guess. Again, in terms of actually who said what about meeting, I wasn't there, I'm afraid. Sorry, I'm just to remind you, there is a summary of the meeting. Again, you have that in front of you. That's on page 19, paragraphs 432, 433 of CDO2. Sorry?
Yeah, CD20.
Yeah, 20, sorry.
Okay, so I think that the picture I'm getting, I think, is that at the early part of plan preparation, the council, you say, I don't want to put words into your mouth, but I think what you're ultimately saying in effect is that the council had an open mind about meeting housing needs at that stage. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
Had various discussions with neighbours, and others as well. Is that
correct,
right?
Yeah.
And as a result of all that, and what presumably looking at the MPPF, which starts off with a starting point is that local plans should meet objectively assessed needs. That's the sort of starting point in paragraph 14 of the MPPF. You decided that that's the way that you ought to go and take the MPPF's starting point as the way forward for the plan and meeting needs.
That's correct. That's correct, yes.
Is that about the size of it?
Absolutely.
Yes, and paragraph 47, first bullet as well.
Yeah.
Yep.
The other point that we heard from Mr. Corsia there was, in effect, I think, and correct me again if I've got this wrong, Mr. Corsia, but I think that what you're saying as well, yeah, paragraph 14 says, yes, local plans should meet objectively assessed needs, unless, and then there are 2 bullet points which say, any adverse impacts of doing so would significantly and demonstrably outweigh the benefits when assessed against the policies in the MPPF, or specific policies in the framework indicate that development should be restricted. Would there be any adverse impacts from meeting your own need?
Well, I'll let Mr. Slater deal with the details in a moment, but it's acknowledged there is going to be some harm, but it wasn't considered that it reached, it got into the second bullet of paragraph 14, i.e. the adverse impact significantly and demonstrably outweigh the benefits. And the whole plan process has been directed to assessing whether we should meet the policy off number, or whether we should have a more restricted approach. And as you know, we went for the unrestricted approach and didn't consider that it was a preferable option to extend development into peripheral areas, which would bring sustainability and other harms. And that's documented in the material. Yeah, and Mr. Linus quite rightly reminds me, of course, you only get into the 2 sub-points in paragraph 14 if you don't meet the objectively assessed needs. And so, and we say we have assessed the harms, we have assessed the balance in the sustainability appraisal and the other work that's been done, and you simply don't get into it.
Forgive me,
yes,
Mr. Rowe. I didn't quite follow the point that you were prompted by your colleague
yes.
about.
I think the point is that we are not seeking to avoid meeting the objectively assessed needs, and that in any event, you don't get into the territory even if you're into the indents to the second bullet, because we've undertaken the work which supports the view that it doesn't significantly and demonstrably, etc. And you have the documentation to support that analysis.
Okay, I'm reluctant to go too far down this road today. I mean, it does play into, clearly, the question of the duty to cooperate, but I think it's probably more something to pick up in discussion tomorrow rather than today. I mean, it is obviously relevant, but I think I probably want to hold that point there unless anyone has, crikey, quite a few people have quite a few enlightening things to say on the matter.
Yeah, sorry, I forgot to put mine down actually. Mr. Corsier covered all the points that I wanted to raise in terms of the duty to cooperate, so I'm happy to leave it there.
Do you want, I think there's someone who want to say something else. Do you want to hear them before I respond on the other points? Yeah.
Okay, we'll just go around the table. Is it? Sorry, I can't read that, unfortunately, is it?
Tony Dennis.
Mr. Dennis, thank you.
I would have thought the general principle of the MPPF in the duty to cooperate would also consider large-scale infrastructure projects. So in other words, it would extend beyond